It was a humid afternoon in a small town just outside of Atlanta. Officer Darren Harkins was patrolling his usual route, squinting against the glaring sun. Harkins, a 15-year veteran of the force, had a reputation. His colleagues knew him as someone who didn't bother hiding his disdain for certain people, the black community in particular. Darren's past was littered with accusations of misconduct, but none had ever stuck. His authority was rarely questioned. Driving slowly down the street, Harkins noticed a black man sitting alone in an old beat-up car outside a cafe. The man was casually dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, sipping on a cup of coffee, but something about him irked Harkins. He didn't belong there, at least not in Harkins' eyes. Harkins pulled over, parking his cruiser a few feet behind the man's car. He stepped out, adjusted his belt, and slowly walked toward the vehicle. "Afternoon," Harkins said, the hostility in his voice barely hidden. The man looked up, seemingly unfazed. He offered a polite nod. "Afternoon, officer. Anything wrong?" Harkins narrowed his eyes. "What are you doing here? This isn't exactly your side of town." The man raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor only irritating Harkins more. "I'm just having a cup of coffee. Is that a problem?" "You got ID on you?" Harkins demanded, his hand already drifting toward the gun holstered at his waist. The man reached into his pocket slowly and handed over his ID without a word. Harkins glanced at it. The name read James Carter. There was no criminal record, but that didn't matter to Harkins. He felt a sense of power coursing through him. He had the upper hand. "Step out of the car," Harkins ordered abruptly, stepping back to give the man space. James complied without resistance, but Harkins could sense his calmness was deliberate. There was something about this man that Harkins didn't like, a confidence that didn't fit the usual profile. It made him uneasy, though he wouldn't admit it. As soon as James was standing, Harkins grabbed his arm roughly and twisted it behind his back. "You're under arrest," he muttered. "For what?" James asked, his voice still calm but now with a tinge of curiosity. "Suspicious behavior," Harkins snapped. He didn't need a reason, or at least he didn't think he did. By now, a few passers-by had started to notice. Some took out their phones to record. Harkins ignored them. He was used to it. They wouldn't stop him. They never had before. James didn't resist, but he gave Harkins a look that made the officer's stomach churn. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was something else. As Harkins tightened the cuffs, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The windows were tinted and Harkins couldn't see who was inside. His hand instinctively moved to his holster again, his paranoia growing. Two men in suits stepped out of the vehicle. They walked toward Harkins with the kind of authority that immediately shifted the atmosphere. Something was off. "Officer," one of the men said, flashing a badge. "Special Agent Matthews, FBI." Harkins froze. "FBI?" Matthews nodded toward James. "That man you're arresting, he's with us." Harkins' heart skipped a beat. His grip on James loosened slightly, but he quickly recovered. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, trying to sound in control, but his voice betrayed him. The second agent, a woman with a stern expression, stepped forward. "You just arrested a federal agent, Officer Harkins. James Carter is one of our top field agents, currently working on a very important operation." Harkins blinked, his mind racing. "That's impossible. I asked for his ID. He didn't say a word about being FBI." The female agent's eyes narrowed. "He didn't need to. You didn't give him a chance." By now, a small crowd had gathered, phones still recording. Harkins felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him. Sweat trickled down his back as he glanced from James to the FBI agents. His arrogance began to crack. James finally spoke up, his calm tone now replaced with something sharper. "You really should have done your homework, officer. I'm not just some random guy sitting in a car. I'm here on official business." Harkins's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I didn't know. How was I supposed to know?" he stammered. Matthews stepped forward, his voice low but menacing. "You weren't supposed to assume. That's the point. Instead, you saw a black man sitting in a car, and that was enough for you, wasn't it?" Harkins' face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The crowd murmured. The phones were still recording. The weight of the situation began to sink in. Harkins wasn't just dealing with a routine arrest gone wrong. He was standing in the middle of a PR disaster. The female agent reached for the cuffs and unlocked them, freeing James. "You should have thought twice before making this move," she said coldly. Harkins backed up, his mind swirling. This couldn't be happening. He was an officer. He had control. But now, it was slipping through his fingers. James turned to face him fully, his eyes sharp with a calm fury. "I hope this makes you think twice the next time you try to pull a stunt like this. I won't be the last black man you see, but I'll be the one you remember." Matthews motioned for James to follow him, but before they left, he turned back to Harkins. "We'll be reporting this to your department. I suggest you start thinking about your future." Harkins stood there, frozen, as the FBI agents drove off with James. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. He was still trying to process what had just happened when his radio buzzed. "Officer Harkins, we need you back at the station, now." The voice was cold, official. Harkins knew what it meant. This wasn't going away. As he slowly walked back to his cruiser, the realization hit him like a freight train. He had crossed the line one too many times, and this time, he had messed with the wrong person. The world had just seen a racist cop try to arrest an innocent black man, but that black man wasn't just anyone. He was FBI. And Harkins's career was about to crash harder than he ever thought possible. As Officer Harkins drove back to the station, his mind was racing. He had always believed he could get away with his actions, but this time he had messed with someone far more powerful than he could have imagined. The FBI. His chest tightened as he thought about what would happen next. When he arrived at the station, the mood was grim. His fellow officers gave him sideways glances, and there was a cold silence that hadn't been there before. Captain Reyes, a stern man who had always tolerated Harkins's behavior, was waiting for him by the entrance, arms crossed. "Harkins, in my office, now," Reyes said, his tone harsh and final. Harkins swallowed hard, nodded, and followed Reyes into the office. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud. Harkins sat down, trying to compose himself, but his heart was pounding in his chest. Reyes didn't sit. He paced behind his desk, his eyes burning holes into Harkins. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Reyes started, his voice low but full of barely contained anger. "You arrested a federal agent. The FBI is breathing down our necks. The media has already picked up the story. There are videos circulating everywhere." Harkins shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, I didn't know—" Reyes cut him off. "That's exactly the problem, Harkins. You didn't know and you didn't care. You saw a black man sitting in a car and you thought it was enough reason to harass him. And now the entire department is going to pay the price for your ignorance." Harkins tried to defend himself. "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," Reyes snapped. "You've had complaints before, dozens of them. We looked the other way because you've been on the force for years. But this is different. This is the FBI, Harkins. You've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." Harkins felt the walls closing in. He was used to getting away with things, used to being protected by his badge and his seniority. But this time, it was clear he wouldn't be shielded. Reyes took a deep breath, his tone softening slightly, but not out of sympathy. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Internal Affairs will be investigating, and I'm pretty sure you'll be lucky if suspension is all you get." He leaned over the desk, his face inches from Harkins. "You're done here, Darren. You hear me? Done." Harkins didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth was dry and his head was spinning. Reyes opened the door and motioned for him to leave. The walk back was brutal. His colleagues didn't speak, but they knew. He was the story. Disgrace. As he stepped outside, he could hear his phone vibrating in his pocket. He took it out and saw lots of notifications. His name was all over the headlines. "Racist cop arrests FBI agent in shocking display of misconduct." He saw videos of him cuffing James Carter, the crowd filming, and the FBI agents arriving. The whole world saw him for who he really was. He couldn't escape it. Harkins looked at the town he had patrolled for so many years. He felt small and powerless. His badge meant nothing. He got into his car and sat there staring at the steering wheel. His career was over, his reputation ruined. There was no way to fix this. James Carter sat in the back seat of the SUV on the highway. He stared out the window, thinking. He'd faced racism all his life, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him. It was about the many others who had gone through the same thing but didn't have the FBI's support. He hoped this moment would open people's eyes, but he knew this was just one battle in a larger war. What about Officer Darren Harkins? He would be another footnote in a long history of injustice. His actions would follow him forever.